Welcome to Expert Series, where we explore the issues shaping Canadian national security and defense. I'm Claire Parsons, a research assistant for the CDA Institute. Moderating today is Queen's PhD candidate Benjamin Ofosu-Atuahene, who will be speaking with four experts on the Canadian Africa Strategy, the recently released guiding document on Canadian-African collaboration. Joining us today is Dr. David Black, Professor of International Development Studies at Dalhousie University and Interim Director for the Center for the Study of Security and Development. Additionally, we welcome Dr. Marie-Joelle Zahar, a professor of political science and director of the Research Network on Peace Operations and fellow at the Center for International Research and Studies at the Université de Montréal. Also joining us today are two Queen's University professors, Dr. Yolande Bouka, whose specialty is in women, peace and security, and African politics, and Dr. Andrew Grant, who spoke on conflict and cooperation in natural resource sectors and African security. Our experts discussed enhancing relationships with Africa and emphasizing the importance of navigating the variety of states and relationships existing concurrently on the continent. In particular, essential questions about technology, capacity building, and critical minerals were all asked and analyzed through the lens of ensuring that any Canadian-African relationships also aligned with African Union priorities. Our experts emphasized the need for ethical diplomatic engagement and for Canada to act as a listener more than a leader if it wants to contribute to substantial and effective development in Africa. This is Expert Series.
I'm Benjamin, and I'll be the moderator for today's episode. Once again, thank you for joining, and we are here to explore some of the key themes from the Canada-Africa strategy, with particular focus on how it intersects with defense, security, and strategic interest, especially around critical minerals and also sustainable partnerships. I sent your way some of the questions that I had in mind with a little background. So let's get into it then. Okay. So the first question, as part of Africa's strategy, Canada emphasizes capacity building, which is nice, and especially in critical areas such as defense, security, and governance. However, there is a notable hesitancy when it comes to transfer of military technology or even any form of technology for that matter, even when it comes to like medical technology and other things. And these are driven by concerns about misuse, one, and also security issues. For African nations, particularly like regions in the Sahel, the need for technological advancements in defense and cybersecurity is increasing. And not just the Sahel, when you look at the western part of Africa, there's been several stories that Russia has trolls, in those part of the world that also feed into the misinformation going on. And there's a cybersecurity problem. These countries often face complex security threats, yet military capabilities remain limited due to restricted access to modern technologies. And this, I mean, for those governments to be able to control these particular cyber security issues. The question then is, given the growing importance of technology in defense and security, Canada's Africa strategy seeks to enhance capacity building in African nations. However, with a limited direct transfer of technology, how can Africa support how can Canada support African countries in developing their own defense and cybersecurity technologies? And what role can Canada play in fostering local innovation in Africa?
I think the question seems to assume that Canada is prepared to step into a more active role in terms of defense and security collaboration. And I would have some quite mixed feelings about that, given the distinctive strengths that Canada brings to this equation. We're not going to be supplanting the roles of traditional security partners in terms of the provision of high technology armaments or cybersecurity elements. I think that if there's an opportunity, I think it would rest with some of the things that Canada has historically done, but has done far less of than it should in recent years, which have to do with force enablers, with security force assistance, with support for the use of technology to enhance capacities in the field And I think that I guess it would connect to a larger theme that I would want to stress, which is that we need to be consistently present and build trustworthy relationships in order to be able to work in these kinds of very sensitive spaces. And that's something that we have not done consistently for a significant period of time. So those are very broad comments, but I would say that we're not trying to supplant France, obviously, or others, um, but that we can make a meaningful contribution to working with and responding to the priorities of African partners in this area.
Well, I can add, I think, what's interesting about this approach of capacity building, excuse me, is that it seems to leave out other conversations about how technology is used on the continent, how it emerges, and how it's developed. The African Union already has a space technology, science, technology, and space kind of department. Um, Part of that conversation probably should be had with, what are the priorities of the African Union in terms of development for technology, peace and security, but also technology broadly speaking, in terms of, and here I'm moving a little bit away from defense specifically, but other types of technological uses with regards to providing economic services and facilitation of trade, with regards to education, with regards to health and service deliveries. And I think, part of the strategy should probably take into consideration the type of innovations that are already happening on the continent. So one of the limitation of how this strategy is developed, in my opinion, is that it's written with the assumption that capacity building is not already happening in so many ways on the continent, and the ways in which um, kind of innovations are driven by young individuals that are participating in technology innovation conversations. So the capacity building needs to be done in a way that is not only in conversation with the security sector, um, but also various sectors of interest, in conversation with tech hubs that are, in different parts of the continent, in South Africa, in Kenya, Nigeria, and other places. And there's also a need to be cautious about the securitization of technology development, right? Um,
Maybe I'll actually jump in and add to that because it seems to me that there are other challenges that are not spelled out in the strategy as it stands. And maybe the strategy is not the place to spell these out in detail, but they need to be taken on board before Canada decides what to do, where to do it, and with who. The first is that, we've talked a lot about who the partners might be. Major regional powers, South Africa, Kenya, the AU. But we also need to think about the fact that there is a lot of tension in the continent nowadays, with some of the sub-regional organizations being challenged, members actually bolting out of some of them and creating their own fora. And this is particularly relevant in the Sahel region, which has been mentioned in your background introduction, Benjamin. The question then becomes, who does Canada help? Do we understand how partnering with some countries might actually also affect the way in which we are perceived with others, or partnering with some regional organizations perceived how we are partnering with others? And also, if we go back to, our previous involvement in capacity building, which tended to be more on the training side, there are lessons to be drawn from that capacity building, because although the training was never directly associated with, for example, the coup d'etats by militaries. When one looks at the profiles of the strong men who have taken control in places like Mali, Niger, Burkina, they've all been beneficiaries of training. And my colleague Theo McLaughlin, for example, has written about this, suggesting that The training might not be directly responsible, but it does provide, for example, prestige, power, which elevates some people and might allow them, no matter what their intentions, to be able to pursue objectives in much more efficient way than other contenders for power. Control of technology is equally a source of power and leverage. And therefore, um, good analysis of the context, the actors is absolutely necessary. And again, this might not be the place to do it, but the strategy is a bit undifferentiated when it comes to these things, which raises questions about, the extent to which Canada, which has been absent from the continent, is reinvesting in presence in various locales, actually has its finger on the pulse to understand all of these complexities.
Okay, I can weigh in with a couple of brief comments on this front. This is more about the concerns that you do see in the Canada Africa strategy paper, but even in the question around dual use around certain military technologies. And the example that comes to mind is the use of drones. And so drones can be used for benevolent purposes and more malevolent purposes. And so, for instance, there's been drone use to deliver medicine in remote parts of the African continent, different programs that have been quite successful. But on the flip side, of course, those very same drones could be used to deliver bombs. And although I'm not saying that medical delivery drones have been used in this way, there is the potential. And there are reports that the Congolese army has purchased drones to use them in exactly that purpose to drop bombs on M23 formations. And so there's also been reports of drone use in Sudan, in the Sudanese civil war. And so that's just a comment on some of the concerns about technology transfer and dual use purposes. And drones is one that comes to mind quite readily. And we do see that in practice. Now, the extent to which Canada has a role in drone provision, that I'm completely uncertain of, but it's an example of dual use technology. And again, trying to understand why there might be some apprehension or thought about, transfer technology and its limits. Drone use would be an example on the one hand, but on the other hand, where we have seen technology transfer and capacity life for good, the Kimberley process is an excellent example of this.
All right, thank you very much. I just have a little follow up. So, does this portray that technological help is only important when it's benefiting that particular partner that wants to partner Africa?
I think it's definitely a good question to ask, right? And also, and this is also linked to this kind of people to people interaction is, who is the technology meant to benefit? Are we talking solely about the state, or are we thinking about civil society? Are we talking about individuals on the day to day? I think those questions are also very important to ask because with the state focus sometimes what I thought about the strategy was very state and high level focused. And so when we're thinking about technology and security, we shouldn't only think about national or state level security, but we should also think about safety of individuals, for example. I think another thing that your question brings to me is the fact, for example, that even countries who have drone technology, such as the United States or France or others, have questionable uses of those technology. So I think this is part of a broader conversation about uh, unmanned technology that has dual purpose, surveillance technology that is not only used sometimes to suppress civil society organization in Africa, but is also used to suppress dissent in the West. So we also have to be very careful about how we make assumptions about positive and negative actors when, you know, we also struggle with the ethics of using this technology. So I think one thing that is extremely important, and it's linked to your question, is it's not only the fear of potential negative actors, because I think those exist everywhere, but also broad conversations about the ethics related to technological developments, particularly in the context like various African countries who tend to, due to expedient needs, leapfrog technological developments in order to address the needs of the day to day. So there's an ethical conversation that is necessary, not only with regards to developing partnerships with Africa, broadly speaking, but how the use of technology needs to come with a conversation about ethics of how we use it across the world. As Canada is developing these and exchanges, it also needs to have a conversations about how those technologies can be used for good or for negative purposes across the world, and therefore be part of a lot of the conversations already happening on the continent about ethics and ethical use of technology.
I think we have to approach, and the strategy gets some of this, but I think we have to approach this whole exercise with a high degree of humility. That we really are, we're not, first of all, as you've already intimated, we are in a period of tremendous instability, geopolitical instability, normative instability, contestation in terms of the array of actors that Africa can and is and should partner with. So we're entering a crowded field with limited understanding, and I think that the first point of departure is to approach this. As I've already suggested, in a responsive way, and to spend a lot of time listening. We have some things that we bring to bear, and it makes sense to emphasize those kinds of elements. But the starting point is to understand well enough, first of all, who are the sorts of people that we want to, sorts of institutions, sorts of actors that we want to partner with. And to diversify those relationships as much as possible. This runs right up against the fact that we're dealing with tremendous resource constraints in the Canadian environment, tremendous pressure to diversify, all of which will place demands on the entire international policy establishment of the Canadian state and others. We need to be modest in what we can expect to achieve, but nevertheless build sustained relationships that we're prepared to stay the course on.
Maybe I'll jump into the fray here. And let me say that in the past, Canada's discursive approach has often been to separate itself from the rest of the Western countries by highlighting the fact that we did not have a history of colonialism, which might have been true in the global South, but not necessarily internally. And so I was slightly actually comforted to see in the strategy an acknowledgement of the internal colonialism, which has so deeply affected our relations to our own First Nations. And I do think that that is a starting point. But to the issue of Western commitments to international norms, the continent is connected. It follows what happens internationally. And we, like other Western countries, are being called upon to justify our very selective, upholding of certain norms as opposed to others, particularly on what many countries on the continent see as a glaring difference in the way in which we treat two of the most important conflicts internationally, Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Gaza. And so I do think that we're going to need to do more. We're going to need to think about how to make sure our strategy walks the talk. It is not clear to me that this is going to be easy, particularly because there are considerations related to our own relationship to the United States, our dependence on the United States, that will not allow us to say some things that African countries now want to hear. And I'm thinking, for example, of South Africa's leadership on the International Court of Justice case on Israeli behavior in the Gaza Strip. So I do think that there are challenges here. Now, how can we avoid perceptions of double standard? It seems to me, again, going back to first principles, to use David's vocabulary, there are a couple of things. Ensure that the relationship is not just based on our interest. Listen to what African countries and societies tell us they need and they want. I mean, there's a lot in the strategy about what it is that Canada can offer. There's less of a sense that there has been a consultation with African countries about what they want, what they may want from us. And that, I think, needs to change. I think the other thing as well that might be very useful, which is not directly related to the strategy, but is related to the broader context, is a commitment from Canada to engage in conversations with African countries and others on rejigging the international multilateral system in a way that is more balanced and that is more attuned not just to the interests of those countries that created the system, but also of the countries that now live in it and have issues with the way in which it functions. And so, for example, engaging on reform of the UN Security Council would probably go a long way in helping Canada actually demonstrate its commitment to not just international norms, but to a real dialogue with other countries, particularly on the continent. And I would then say also that we need to really think about Canada beyond the state, and the strategy is focused on the state. But as Andrew knows better than most of us, since this is his area of expertise, the behavior of Canadian mining companies in Africa is something that we cannot continue to distance ourselves from. In an interconnected world, what Canada does or does not do to actually apply the principles that um, guide our own behavior at home, abroad, and in our relationships abroad is going to be one of the best ways to avoid perceptions of double standards.
Thank you so much for the question and for my colleagues' comments on this. I think to the two key words of your question is about trustworthiness and consistency. And in a context where you even if you look at the format of the strategy, we're talking about a Canada-Africa strategy with 54 countries. And so trustworthiness also goes with a sense that the partner actually understands the ecosystem in which it is operating. So I think I go back to what David talked about a little bit earlier in this question is about what humility uh, allows you to do is invest maybe more in the Canadian government on knowledge base and exchanges with regard to Africans. So, what is the number of staff that is in government that is specifically dedicated to dealing with a continent of 54 countries? What kind of expertise do they seek, like it was mentioned, from the diaspora, but also experts in Canada, but also on the continent? And also, funding, trustworthiness, and consistency. And I know this has been written across various op-eds in the past few weeks, is again comparing the Indo-Pacific strategy with the Canada-Africa strategy, is the clear lack of funding that is associated with the implementation of that strategy. So I think if we have African actors reading the strategy, um, there's definitely really good components to it, but there's a big question mark about whether we can trust a strategy that is not attached with significant investment. Consistency beyond simply, and I think my colleague spoke a lot about international norms, and so I will not repeat their very good comments on this. But it also means consistency in terms of your presence, your engagement, um, and the type of exchanges that facilitate people to people conversation.
The question then is, how does Canada navigate this space, balancing support for African-led approaches with its commitment to democracy and human rights? And also, when civil societies is constrained or sidelined, can people-to-people engagement remain a viable pathway for meaningful cooperation, particularly in areas like defense and security?
I think there's an interesting bridge between the two questions, actually, and I think that I think that this is a terrifically important question, and it dovetails directly with what Yolande was just saying about the importance of deep transsocietal connections alongside interstate connections. I think that one of the ways in which you attempt to grapple with situations where you have an uneasy relationship with particular kinds of regimes, military regimes, and others is by building transsocietal links and also region to region links, because sometimes regional organizations or regional communities can be a way of maintaining connections in difficult circumstances. But broadly speaking, it is tremendously important for durable relationships to build links between civil society groups, between I think researchers are really important in this domain, between diaspora groups. So I think that, and I want to go back to the point that was made about international norms. International norms are in a period of tremendous flux. There is a real contestation over what we acted like were settled norms of democracy and human rights, of a particular version of democracy and human rights in the 1990s and early 2000s. Those are contested norms, and the starting point for beginning to work out a collective understanding is to engage in deep conversations below the interstate level to understand how other communities of people, and specifically in Africa, are thinking about what democracy entails and what their conception of rights are and what their priorities in the firmament of rights are. And so I think one of the really critical priorities, which connects both to diasporas and to the visa regime and to the ability to have fluid relationships across these transsocietal connections, is the need to build and support sustained relationships beneath the level of the state. This also then, of course, sorry, I'm doing the typical academic thing of going on and on, but it spills up to the interstate level, because what we're talking about is the constitution of what become track two connections that can build relationships of trust across partisan divides that can be sustained over the medium to long term.
I think it's interesting. Of course, from the perspective of the West and Canada, um, West broadly speaking, in Canada, particularly in terms of how it looks at its historical partners. When we talk about international norms as now being in flux, I kind of reject that a little bit, because there's definitely a lot of questions about the extent to which these international norms were actually applied. When we think about the early 2000s, for example, I'm thinking about the war in Iraq. I'm thinking about uh, this year's surveillance, uh, increased, uh, you already started to shift towards authoritarianism and far right across different countries in Europe. So, there's also the fact that a lot of these democratic principles are quite recent. So I think, I think what is happening at the moment is maybe the silent bits being spoken out loud, and also realizing that you know democracy is something that needs to be worked on every day and never should be taken for granted. And this then comes to what it means maybe to find viable operations beyond the state. There's a real danger in particularly in closing political spaces across different countries around the world when we focus exclusively on NGOs or civil society organizations, that they then become targeted as being Western funded, and then intervention in civil society spaces. And so we need to be very careful about how we think about engaging civil society organizations in closing political spaces. But one thing that I think uh, may be helpful is us flipping the script a little bit in terms of knowledge exchange and who learns from whom. In a moment of democratic backsliding, and the strategy talks about democratic backsliding exclusively within the African context, but it's a global phenomenon that is happening even in our front door. One of the ways in which you can get creative about exchanges is engaging with civil society organizations from the continent who have worked and agitated to sustain and maintain their democracies, and learn from their experience in terms of what we can do to promote and defend our democracies in Canada and in other places. So I think we need to get creative, because there are serious dangers in offloading collaboration to civil society organization and then putting them at risk in the space in which they're engaging. And so we have to think creatively about what that engagement should look like, but also, again, going back to David's comment about humility also means being able to learn from those non-state actors on the African continent in their variety and diversity in terms of what they do well. We talk often about conflict, but what is actually the most prevalent reality of African societies is that they deal and live with each other in a great deal of diversity. So, how do we learn multiculturalism from countries that live with tens and hundreds of ethno-linguistic groups? What do we learn about fighting for democracy from civil society organizations that have fought for their gains over time? What do we learn about women, peace, and security, for example, because that's the work that I do, part of the work that I do, from NGOs in African settings in a moment of backsliding of feminist rights as well at home. So I think we need to get creative, but also learn that this partnership is not just one that tries to help the continent, but where we can actually learn from those 54 countries and their realities.
I mean, again, building from the comments that David and Yolande have already made, the fiction of, strong, vibrant democracies promoting democracy elsewhere is now being uncovered. I'm not saying that there were no strong democracies, or, that the enterprise of democratic socialization was necessarily always, informed by devious intentions or like hidden intentions. But we oversold how strong our democracies were and did not really acknowledge the deep problems we had inside. And we also, to Yolande's point, um, did not engage with other countries on their own understanding of what democracy is, what was, the field of the possible there. We often try to plunk our own model and, export it as is into countries which had very different realities. And in so doing, We failed ourselves and we failed those countries. So it seems to me that we should probably, particularly given all that has happened in the last couple months, bracket this and engage with other countries on the basis of shared interests. But interests in what? Stabilizing this world, ensuring continued cooperation on issues which are deeply interrelated, interdependent, and which require countries to work together. And maybe judge countries on what they do, not what they say. I'm not saying that we shouldn't push for democracy. This is a value that Canada tries to promote. But it seems to me that it is more important, and I'm going to talk here about, the realm of defense and security, for example, that as we're trying to think about how democracy is supposed to improve the security of countries, that we are actually also humble enough to listen to people who tell us that certain democratic practices actually create insecurities for certain categories of people. And that is something that we have not yet, necessarily always taken on board, and which requires the kind of granular understanding that Yolande was talking about earlier on, which for the moment does not seem to exist in the way in which the strategy is thinking about those issues.
And maybe I'll weigh in at this stage as well to comment on some of the other co-panelists' remarks and address back to moderators' follow-up questions. Again, sort of what can Canada do in this regard? And but reflect on meetings I've had with folks at Global Affairs Canada, and I can see some of the, discussions we've had even in the Canada Africa strategy document, that there is a recognition that you have, when it comes to transnational norms and agency around African actors, state and non-state actors, that there's an underappreciated agency of African actors across many different issue areas, ranging from rule of law to ending impunity for war crimes, and then more specific transnational norms, whether again it's on the trade of conflict diamonds or other issues. And I see a little bit of this in this document. And I guess the recognition is that indeed African state and non-state actors, they're not just passive transnational norm recipients. They influence transnational norms. They instigate transnational norms. They can block transnational norms, and they do. And we see variance over time. But I think of the case too, you see even certain key countries where we've seen important changes. So South Africa and the International Criminal Court, one of the very early supporters and signatories of the ICC. Yet under the Zuma administration, you saw a shift away, calls for withdrawing from the ICC, allowing Omar al-Bashir to visit South Africa. And again, the political leadership not wanting to take him into custody, but the South African Supreme Court issuing orders for him to be taken into custody. And of course, he had to leave in a very rapid fashion. And then now you see South Africa's role in support of the International Court of Justice. Again, these wider transnational norms around the rule of law. So again, some change even from South Africa, one of the leaders across the continent. So it is being recognized. We may not always see it in actions, and even in the Canada Africa strategy paper, maybe we'd like to see more of that recognition. But we also know when it comes into even the wording and phrasing in these policy documents, the initial draft and the sections I'm sure were drafted to go into what we saw, into what's a relatively short document. I'm sure we're voluminous what gets through. All right. The political masters and powers that be, right, do a great deal of gatekeeping. And in some ways, as many of you all know, that this Canada Africa strategy paper was in the works for quite a while. And some thought we may never see it, or it may not actually see the light of day, and then it did. And so, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes in terms of actually producing what we see as the final documents. And wider readers of the document may not know that. I'm sure the folks on this panel do, but that's something, right? Because it is influential. And again, in terms of next steps, right? What is the thinking of the bureaucrats behind the scenes? And the linkages established with the AU Commission is quite substantive, and there's been a lot of fanfare around that. Could this have happened faster, more extensively? Sure. But then again, the realities of how the politics of all this unfold, that has to be addressed. And Yolande's comment about comparing with the Indo-Pacific strategy, again, this emphasizes many of the points I'm trying to make, that there is quite a substantial difference, whether it's the exchange of people to other resources behind the two, to even the timelines. Because, of course, the Indo-Pacific strategy came out much sooner and seemed to have a lot of initial fanfare and focus. And so these are some of the dynamics. And when you talk to people in government, they face a lot of challenges, whether it's internal resources, subject to, again, the political masters at higher levels. And so you get that particular insight. And so, I think that's something there's a small element of optimism that I can see in terms of the way that this has been crafted. But, of course, many shortcomings to be sure.
Question 4. So Africa holds a significant share of the world's critical minerals. Yeah. Essentially for the global green energy transition. These minerals are central to industries such as electric vehicles, renewable energy technologies, and electronics in general. However, mining practices in Africa often face challenges related to governance, labor conditions, and environmental impact. Despite these challenges, Africa's mineral resources remain a key point of focus for many global powers, including Canada. Canada's African strategy, with its emphasis on sustainable trade and ethical practices, presents an opportunity for the country to engage more responsibly in Africa's mining sector, potentially setting global standards for ethical sourcing and development. However, the push for access to critical minerals also raises the question of how Canada can align its economic interests with its broader values of human rights, environmental protection, and good governance. The question then is, with the emphasis on critical minerals and sustainable trade in Canada's Africa strategy, how do these economic priorities align with Canada's broader security interests? Can securing access to critical minerals in Africa be considered part of Canada's national security strategy, especially in the context of increasing competition over global supply chains and push towards energy transition?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to lead things off on this particular question. And critical minerals does appear throughout the Canada's Africa strategy document. Canadian government itself has a critical mineral strategy paper that it published a couple of years ago. And so the Canada Africa strategy paper points out that Africa has roughly 30% of all critical mineral reserves. But it doesn't point out that Canada has roughly the same, anywhere between 20 and 30%. So together, Canada and the African continent have roughly half or more than half of global critical mineral reserves, and quite a spread across all the different critical minerals that do exist. And in the African context, you have the DR Congo, Zambia, and South Africa is really leading the way, but again, a good spread across the continent. So in the wider context of geopolitics, again, coming to the fore, you do see in that context, if Canada and the African continent have 50 to 60% of all critical minerals, that is significant. That gives significant clout in the geopolitics of the critical minerals trade. Of course, some of the other major players or other powers on critical minerals, well, China, Australia, and Russia. And again, of course, you have countries that have certain critical minerals in good abundance, but that spread, right? There's very few countries. And again, if you think, what might be the prospects might be for Canada and the African continent, again, that is quite significant. And you do have the shift increasingly still. You might have some consumer demand for EVs flattening out, but you still have significant demand for what those critical minerals produce, right? And dual use. And so you have solar panels and wind turbines and the batteries for EVs, but you have military applications as well. So whether it's radar arrays or a sophisticated military aircraft and the like, you have this dual use. So the demand is going to continue to grow. And so Canada and the African continent are very well placed. But again, in the geopolitics of things, we see a very transactional government to our south and interested in our critical minerals in Greenland and Ukraine, but also in Africa. The U.S., it's been flying under the radar, but there's been negotiations for access to DRC's critical minerals. Interestingly, that's been initiated by the DRC for a security guarantee, right? For a security guarantee looking to the U.S. some sort of arrangement to be made where U.S. interests would have greater access to Congolese critical minerals. And so the Congolese government is not looking to Canada to provide security guarantees, but they are looking to the U.S. And so there has been progress made, although again, it's flying under the radar given all the other events that go in week in and week out, led by the Trump administration. And so along those lines, what would be key, and this has come up in our earlier conversations, trusting relationships between Canada and the African continent.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question. So when it comes to natural resources, especially in Africa, of course, there's that security backing, and that many African countries, like you said, Congo, would be willing to trade that for security guarantees. So it makes me think out loud. Would one reason why Canada has never been considered for these things, because China has been getting deals like that, and I'm hearing the US is also doing that. Canada might not be. Could it be the case that Canada might not be getting these deals because of its less military capabilities? Because for a country, or for an African country to be able to give you, its minerals for security guarantees.
I think it's an interesting question, and I'm sure Andrew knows more about this. But you mentioned China. China is not providing military capability. China, among other things, is providing infrastructure development, right? And so, one of the things that we have to think about. So, given on the one hand, you already have a setting where Canadian mining companies have a significant presence on the continent, right? It's the practices of some of their companies are questionable, but that's also comes with extractive industries, whether they are operating in the African continent or whether they are operating here in Canada. We have significant challenges here as well when it comes to extractive industries. But to go back to your question about military support, it's identifying what's your strength as a country in terms of what you can offer as well. And so when you think about the United States having these conversations, or you think about Belgian companies or other types of companies or countries, there are also challenges in terms of trades, right? So how the agreements about access to mining are being written in some of those back rooms. But I want to kind of go back to the distinction between what maybe some countries like Russia or the US are providing in terms of quote unquote security in exchange to access to some of these minerals, and what China is doing, which is completely different, which is, often part of complex loans and also infrastructure development, which are linked to those loans, right? So identifying what you have to offer as a country is also critical. So it's not just in terms of military guarantee. I don't think the Canadian military has the capacity to provide. It already struggles to engage in peacekeeping operations. The Canadian Armed Forces are struggling in terms of meeting their basic number of recruits and keeping their recruits. So it is definitely not in a position to offer security guarantees to a country like Congo or a country like Burkina Faso, for example. But China doesn't offer security guarantees. It offers infrastructure development. So what is it that Canada could also think about contributing that is in line with priorities of these African continent?
So maybe jumping in here, then, if that's okay, but briefly to actually connect Yolande's point with both her earlier discussion of ethics and with Andrew's observation that civil society or communities rather will often not be at the table when there are discussions about the extraction of these minerals. Yet there are strong ethical reasons why, given the environmental impact of these things, and given also the issues of social justice, and thinking about how resource sharing you know um is addressed in those countries, there is actually something that Canada could do, and which would actually signal our intention to be a good partner and to be a partner that is both not only reliable, but also well intentioned. And that is to actually connect our First Nations who have been part and parcel of a lot of these negotiations with the extractive industries here and who have a lot of experience
Mhm.
to with the communities that will be concerned in an effort to make sure that as this rush for critical minerals, proceeds apace, the ethical issues, the environmental issues, the social justice issues are not actually pushed under the rug. If the Canadian government brought with it into discussions with these countries a number of Indigenous elders and leaders who've been involved in this, including women, given that there is a real gender dimension to these issues, that would be one way in which we could actually demonstrate, that we are partners worthy of trust.
If I can just quickly jump in, I think those are excellent points. I think we have to understand that in many ways, um, we're peer participants in this domain, right? We have shared many of the same challenges, some of the same um, injustices, some of the same environmental disasters associated with these kinds of undertakings, and so. Um, First of all, we have a shared strategic interest in the ways in which these resources are developed because we share with African countries a very significant presence. But secondly, that all sounds a little bit idealistic, I realize, but I think that there's an opportunity for a different kind of approach and for a kind of expertise that is a shared interest in terms of how you do these things in environmentally sound and socially just ways.
Thank you very much for the clarification. I really appreciate it. All right. So the last question: while Canada has carved out a softer, more principled image than other countries like US or France in its engagement with Africa, it still shares many of the same structural hesitations common across Western states. These include a cautious, bureaucratic approach that slows responsiveness and limits support for more adaptive, locally led initiatives. Canada also often prefers to work through multilateral institutions rather than forging deep bilateral ties, which can dilute the sense of mutual accountability or tailored partnership. Like other donors, its assistance is frequently tied to normative expectations around democracy, human rights, and good governance. Expectations that sometimes ring hollow when Western countries themselves fall short. And while Canada funds valuable programs, they focus tend to fall on short-term projects with measurable outputs rather than long-term institutional investments that will strengthen Africans' capacity and sovereignty over time. The main question then is, looking forward, looking ahead, how can Canada shift its security partnership to focus more on empowering local ownership, fostering long-term poverty alleviation, and building humanitarian resilience in Africa, especially beyond just providing training or logistical support? What changes would make Canada's involvement more responsive to the real complex challenges in Africa?
I think we've been talking about this in different ways. That really, this is the fundamental challenge. That this is about investing time, people, capacities in building um, long-term relationships with particular countries, and I actually think that we need to uh, think carefully about strategic bilateral relationships, but not bilateral relationships in simply the state-to-state context, but also in terms of transsocietal links. I think that some of the points that Yolande made earlier about the contrast with the Indo-Pacific strategy, where there's significant investment in exchange relationships, research collaborations. One of the themes in this strategy is youth that aligns strongly with youth exchanges, especially at the post-secondary level, which I think is enormously important. You know, the we have there is a fundamental challenge in understanding that the African context, broadly understood, is as a rich site of opportunities understood in the broadest sense, and that we need to stay the course. My own research, as many people know, is focused on the pattern of consistent inconsistency, that we have these flourishes where we act like we have a kind of deep interest and vocation in Africa, and then something catches our attention somewhere else, and it's always pushed to the back burner. This strategy has to break that cycle if it's going to be meaningful, and part of it is not overpromising. One of the things that I really struggle with is that when we act like we are leaders, we liberally use the word leadership in the way we describe our engagements with pretty much everywhere in the world, but certainly with Africa, and most of the time that's not what we are, and it's not viable. But that doesn't mean that the contribution can't be meaningful. So it's about modesty, but consistency in our expectations, and looking for and building relationships over the medium to long term. Sorry, that's very vague, but back to first principles. But I think that's hopefully what this strategy can begin to be a part of the turn that needs to take place.
Let me actually jump in, because I think that we cannot talk about this or answer that question without acknowledging that between the time the strategy was being discussed and the time where it's going to be implemented, the world has fundamentally changed. And decisions taken in Washington are going to have a huge impact on the continent. They're also going to have a huge impact on Canada's ability, both in terms of, focus, in terms of, human resources, and in terms of financial means to do much more than deal with its current relationship with our neighbor to the south. So to David's point, we may not be able to do much, and the strategy touches upon different areas. It might actually be advisable to start small, but stay the course, bearing in mind that we're doing this in an environment that's even more constraining than it was when the strategy was being developed. And I will suggest that if this is about, security for the continent, then one of the most destructuring things for the security writ large, and we're not just talking about national security here, is the axing of USAID and USAID programs on the continent. This is going to affect education, it's going to affect health, it's going to affect employment. And so even if Canada decided to engage meaningfully on one of these things, in a number of countries, I heard yesterday Joanne Liu, who is the former president of Doctors Without Borders, say that there's an estimate of about 200,000 people who might actually die because HIV/AIDS programming has been suspended as a result of the USAID meltdown. So if Canada were able to actually focus on one area and invest in this area meaningfully and consistently, that, I think, would shift not just our security partnerships, but our partnerships and the perception of Canada with those partners that we would actually try and help at a moment where they, like us, are going to be facing existential crises. And I want to actually warn that we don't fall into the trap that we fell into during the pandemic, where we talked about, a problem that was shared, but ultimately decided to resolve that problem in a very self-centered kind of way, and where Canada was actually one of the worst offenders in terms of hoarding vaccines at a time when the continent really needed them. So we do have an opportunity, a golden opportunity, but what we choose, how we do it, and how consistent we are is what is going to shift, in my opinion, um, the nature of our partnerships with um, those countries with which we will decide to work on the continent. Because to Yolande's point, these are 54 countries, very different countries, and Canada does not have, to David's point, the leadership necessary to be everywhere uh, on every issue at the same time.
One of the things I
Also,
think it fits really well with what Marie-Joelle just said is, one of the things that happened when the Organization of African Unity transformed or transitioned into the African Union was a keen understanding of the different dimension and the different factors that impact peace and security on the continent. If you look at the peace and security architecture, the African peace and security architecture, what you see is a very clear understanding of the relationship between gender equality, youth inclusion, environment, um, poverty alleviation. All these things are connected to sustaining peace and security on the continent. That's very clearly articulated by the African Union. And so I think one of the great contribution of Marie-Joelle in her conversation is identifying, even when we're thinking about security from a military standpoint, because we know we are aware of our audience here, is understanding how the African Union and African states over the past decades have understood and articulated the different factors that impact peace and security on the continent. And so, if we are able to identify a few partners and a few spaces where we can contribute to the vacuum that is currently in happening in terms and articulated in terms of security assistance, if within the context of our podcast this is what is important, um, then it demonstrates our commitment to peace and security, even in a context where we are as a country limited in terms of our military capacity. Militarizing peace and security in Africa has not necessarily yielded the expected outcome. And that's very well understood within the African Union. And I think this is where, in terms of partnership and security partnership, contributing to some of those developmental, economic, and gender equality spaces that are part and parcel of sustaining peace and security in Africa is a way to foster long-term relationships in key places, because we do not have the resources to do that or to replace USAID. And I think as well that African states and African actors do not necessarily want a replacement of USAID. I think there's also, from the perspective of African actors, a need to be more sustainable in their own efforts, and that can be part of, as well as co-creating strategies to replace or to fill the gap that's been left with the falling apart of some of those development support from our neighbors to the south.
I was heartened to see discussions around women's economic empowerment and youth empowerment on this particular question. And there's some examples of this in the Canada Africa strategy document. And with respect to security, if there's no other reason why you would want to invest on this front. We do know that when it comes to youth, if they don't have skills and training, if they don't have opportunities for employment and entrepreneurship, they represent a significant pool for rebel groups, armed militias, and extremist groups. And so to address that particular demographic, I think is extremely key. And whether or not it is filling in where USAID may be falling through, or to follow up on Yolande's point, just generally a very important area. That, if we're going to choose one or suggest one or two areas, it would be around that investment in women's economic empowerment through employment, education opportunities, and wider youth opportunities. Again, from a security standpoint, that does represent, if you have huge unemployment and lack of opportunities, that's a huge pool for recruitment, easy recruitment. Again, for rebel groups, armed militias, and extremist groups.
All right. Thank you very, very much to everybody for a thoughtful and engaging discussion.
That brings us to the end of this pod. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. We thank you for listening, and we hope you'll be tuning in next time.